Chapter 7, Controlling Toxic Substances. The learning outcomes for this chapter include identify and define the component steps associated with risk assessment and risk management. Explore and evaluate the effectiveness of the Toxic Substances Control Act in regulating chemicals in industry. Distinguish the roles of 3 different pesticide regulations and acts, FIFRA, FFDCA, and FQPA. Consider and compare international approaches to toxics with those in the United States. Recognize the aspects that characterize toxic torts. Each year in the United States, we manufacture or import 113 kilograms or 250 pounds of chemicals substances for every man, woman, and child. Many of these substances find their way into the soil, air, and water. Dichlorophenyltrichloroethane, also known as DDT, is an insecticide that serves as the classic example of a chemical that was quite effective in its intended use, while also having important unintended ecological and likely human health effects. Biomagnification caused the populations of many North American birds of prey to decline precipitously from 1950 to the 1970s. The peregrine falcon was almost totally wiped out in the eastern United States, and the bald eagle, the U.S. national bird, was virtually eliminated from the lower 48 states. The brown pelican vanished from its Atlantic coast range, remaining only in Florida, and the osprey and other hawks saw substantial population declines. Eventually, scientists determined that DDT was causing the birds' eggshells to grow thinner so that eggs were breaking in the nests and killing the embryos within. In a remarkable environmental success story, populations of all these birds have rebounded since the U.S. banned DDT. The use of DDT was banned in the United States in 1973 and is now illegal in a number of nations. U.S. chemical companies still manufacture and export DDT because developing countries with tropical climates use DDT to control disease vectors such as mosquitoes that transmit malaria. In these countries, malaria represents a greater health threat than do the toxic effects of the pesticide. In cases where compounds are banned here but still sold elsewhere, it's possible that food and other banned pesticide-laden products can be imported back into the United States in what has been called a circle of poison. DDT is an example of a persistent organic pollutant. Persistent organic pollutants are toxic chemicals that adversely affect human health and the environment around the world. Because they can be transported by wind and water, most POPs generated in one country can and do affect people and wildlife far from where they are used and released. They persist for long periods of time in the environment and can accumulate and pass from one species to the next through the food chain. Scientific uncertainty is a problem inherent to regulating toxic and hazardous substances. While you may be able to demonstrate an effect at a particular dosage with a model animal in the lab, or show a trend for people who've been exposed, it is more difficult to decide on a dosage or exposure level with no effect on humans or the environment. In the United States, EPA and OSHA use risk assessment to determine the acceptable risk. How do you decide what rate of exposure is an acceptable risk? Is this the same for the whole population? How the risk is determined. Number 1, hazard identification. Hazard identification aims to determine the qualitative nature of the potential adverse consequences of the contaminant and the strength of the evidence it can have that effect. This is done for chemical hazards by drawing from results of sciences of toxicology and epidemiology. For other kinds of hazard, engineering or other disciplines are involved. 2. Dose-response analysis. Dose-response analysis is determining the relationship between the dose and the probability of the incidence of effect, a dose-response assessment. The complexity of this step is in many contexts derives from the need to extrapolate results from experimental animals, for example, mouse or rat, to humans, and or from a high to lower doses. In addition, the differences between individuals due to genetics or other factors mean that the hazard may be higher for particular groups called susceptible populations. Exposure assessment, number 3. Exposure assessment aims to determine the amount of a contaminant, a dose, that individuals and populations will receive. This is done by examining the results of the discipline of exposure assessment. This is done by examining the results of the discipline of exposure assessment. As different location, lifestyles, and other factors likely influence the amount of contaminant that is received, a range of distribution of possible values is generated in this step. Particular care is taken to determine the exposure of the susceptible populations. Number 4, risk characterization. Risk characterization. In risk characterization, the result of the first 3 steps above are then combined to produce an estimate of risk. For example, the magnitude of public health problem. Because of the different susceptibilities and exposures, this risk will vary within a population. Once the risk is characterized, those involved in regulatory decisions take that into account. However, other factors also influence the decision making. Toxic substances are regulated in a variety of different environmental laws. Generally, toxic refers to something that is directly poisonous to humans. However, in none of the acts that regulate potentially toxic substances is the term defined. Instead, some acts list certain substances that must be regulated as toxins, and other statutes focus on the risk of harm imposed by certain substances that makes them subject to regulation as toxins. Many substances regulated as toxins possess one or more of these characteristics. Effects at extremely low doses. Harmful effects may not show up for decades after the exposure. Bioaccumulation. Persistence or degradation to toxic byproducts. The primary federal control over potentially toxic substances is the 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA. It is implemented by the EPA Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, OPPT, and has not been significantly altered since its promulgation. 3 significant policies are set forth at the beginning of TSCA. 1. Data on environmental effects of chemicals must be developed by industry. 2. The government must have adequate authority to prevent unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment, particularly imminent hazards. And 3. Government authority must be exercised so as to not impede unduly or create unnecessary barriers to technology while fulfilling the primary purpose of the Act. Wholly ambiguous schizophrenic law, Batman. Critics of Tosca say it lacks teeth, and due to its ambiguous language meant to please both environmentalists and industrialists, and also the lack of follow-up amendments or statutes to keep pace with industries regulated. To meet these primary goals, Tosca sets forth different approaches for regulating existing chemicals in industry, old chemicals, versus chemicals introduced after the Act, new chemicals. Existing chemicals are placed on the Chemical Substances Inventory, CSI. Information used to determine whether a chemical is high priority comes from manufacturers and importers and is updated every 4 years. Putting a chemical on the high priority list means that the chemical is subject to further investigation and testing. High priority goes to those chemicals suspected of causing cancer, mutation, or birth defects. Within a 12-month period, the EPA was required to assess the risk of the chemical or issue testing rules if it has insufficient data to assess the risk. Using a hybrid form of rulemaking, the EPA published these testing rules within the reasonable time limits. No more than 50 chemicals were to be on the high priority list at one time. Given the short time frame, it is clear that EPA could not review many chemicals, and they did not. In a study released by the U.S. National Research Council over 10 years after passage of the Act, there were over 18,000 chemicals on the inventory and no information on the toxic effects of 79% of them. And between 1976 and 2009, the EPA had issued regulations to control only 5 existing chemicals. To regulate existing chemicals, the EPA must demonstrate that they pose an unreasonable risk, which the EPA believes requires a cost-benefit analysis that can take years to complete. Currently, there are over 84,000 chemical substances listed on the Tosca Chemical Substance Inventory. If necessary to evaluate potential human health or environmental hazards, the agency may require testing of these substances, and it may regulate, including banning or restricting the manufacture, import, processing, distribution, use, or disposal of any chemicals that present an unreasonable risk of injury to human health or the environment. Tosca regulation of new chemicals requires a pre-manufacturing notice, PMN, or a Section 5 notice, 90 days before a chemical is manufactured or imported for the sale or commercial use. This notice must contain a significant amount of information about the chemical, including its chemical name, chemical identity, molecular structure, trade names or synonyms, byproducts resulting from its manufacture, processing, use, or disposal, intended categories of use by function and application, and the estimated maximum quantity to be manufactured or imported during the first year of production and for any 12-month period during the first 3 years. Details about the manufacture of the product that must be contained in the pre-manufacture notice include the site where the chemical will be manufactured, processed, or used by the manufacturer, as well as information about the worker exposure and releases to the environment. Perhaps the most important information in the notice, however, is the test data. The notice must contain all available test data related to the impact of the new chemical on human health and the environment, including effects resulting not only from use of the substance, but also from its manufacture, processing, distribution, and disposal. If some of the data were obtained from scientific journals, citations of the journal articles must be included. Any new data gathered or generated subsequent to the submission of the pre-manufacture notice must be given to the EPA. Critics of the law point out that the law does not require the companies to test the new chemicals for toxicity. Within 5 days of the receipt of the pre-manufacturer notice, the EPA must publish a notice to the Federal Register containing the name of the new chemical, its intended use, and the test data submitted by the manufacturer to demonstrate that the chemical does not present an unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment. Within 45 days, the EPA must act to limit the amount to be produced, sold, or processed, prohibit the sale or manufacture of the chemical, or require testing and temporarily enjoin the manufacture or sale until the data are provided. In taking action, the EPA must select the least burdensome control. If no action is taken, the manufacturer is free to use the new chemical after the 90-day period has expired. These common products are several of many pesticides: cockroach sprays, insect repellents, rodent poison, flea and tick treatments, home disinfectants and sanitizers, mold and mildew treatments, and some pool and lawn chemical products. Only a few pesticides are available to the general public and can be used by anyone who will follow directions. General use. Most pesticides are considered too hazardous for general use and are restricted to certified applicators. Restricted use. FIFRA established a system of examination and certification both at the private level and at the commercial level for applicators who wish to purchase and use restricted use pesticides. The distribution of restricted use pesticides is also monitored. While restricted use is allowed for certified applicators, this may only mean that the supervisor and not the actual applicator is certified. When a pesticide is to be registered, data showing its impact are submitted to the EPA. The EPA will register the pesticide when 4 factors exist. 1. The pesticide's composition is such as to warrant the proposed claims for it. 2. The labeling complies with the Act. 3. The pesticide will perform its intended function without unreasonable risk to people and the environment, taking into account economic, social, and environmental costs and benefits of the pesticide. And 4. When used in accordance with commonly used practice, the pesticide will not cause unreasonable risk to the environment. Pesticides receive an expedited review if they are similar in composition or labeling to an already registered pesticide. These are called Me Too products. Review is also expedited for products that wouldn't significantly increase the risk of adverse environmental effects. These conditions, as well as no risk of unreasonable adverse effects, also allow conditional registration of pesticides that lack certain data. Registration lasts for 5 years. Within 30 days of expiration, the EPA publishes a notice of cancellation in the Federal Register. Sometimes registrations may be canceled before the 5-year period if there is unreasonable risk present. After a notice of cancellation is published, the manufacturer can object within those 30 days, or else the registration ends. If a cancellation is challenged, the hearing process tends to decide in favor of cancellation, though the pesticide will still be sold during hearings. This does not apply if an imminent hazard is present in this situation. The EPA can suspend use and give the manufacturer 5 days to request a hearing. An emergency suspension is immediate and still allows the manufacturer to pursue a hearing. Pesticides register before November of 1984 must be reviewed and re-registered. If the EPA changes its registration, they have to publish their intent in 45 days before doing so and allow a hearing. If EPA denies a registration, they must give reasons to the manufacturer, who then has 30 days to correct those reasons, or else the denial is published in the Federal Register, allowing 30 more days for the manufacturer to seek further actions. Once a registration is canceled, the EPA allows pesticide stocks to be sold and used as long as there is no harmful risk to the environment. If the stocks are large, the EPA may indemnify or reimburse the farmers and end users. Pesticides with canceled registrations can still be sold abroad, though the EPA notifies foreign governments of canceled products. This leads to a circle of poison within the international trade. The Worker Protection Standard, WPS, program seeks to protect agricultural workers and applicators from injuries and illnesses associated with pesticides. The program mandates protective equipment and training. Violations result in steep fines. Manufacturers must keep records for all their pesticides and allow facility inspections by the EPA. Violations to FIFRA can result in civil or criminal liabilities. Written warnings made in the public interest are issued for minor violations. When there is no significant harm to the environment, knowing violations result in criminal penalties. Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FFDCA, authorizes EPA to set tolerances or maximum residue limits for pesticide residues on foods. In the absence of a tolerance for a pesticide residue, a food containing such a residue is subject to seizure by the government. Once a tolerance is established, the residue level in the tolerance is the trigger for the enforcement actions. That is, if residues are found above that level, the commodity will be subject to seizure. In setting tolerances, EPAs must make a finding that the tolerance is safe. Safe is defined as meaning that there is a reasonable certainty that no harm will result from aggregate exposure to the pesticide residue. To make the safety finding, EPA considers, among other things, the toxicity of the pesticide and its breakdown products, aggregate exposure to the pesticide in foods and from other sources of exposure, and any special risk posed to infants and children. Some pesticides are exempted from the requirement to have a tolerance. EPA may grant exemptions in cases where the pesticide residues do not pose a dietary risk under reasonably foreseeable circumstances. The EPA administrator sets concentration limits to ensure an adequate, wholesome, and economic food supply. The FDA and the USDA FSIS enforce these limits. However, testing food products for pesticides does not occur frequently or comprehensively. The Food Quality Protection Act, FQPA, was enacted in 1996 to resolve inconsistencies between the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FFDCA. For all pesticide residues in food, the EPA has to determine with reasonable certainty that no harm will result from aggregate exposure to each pesticide from dietary and other sources. Risks to children and infants, as well as endocrine disruption potential, must be addressed. A reassessment process has also been set up for existing tolerances. The Pesticide Environmental Stewardship Program is voluntary. It financially supports projects in pesticide-reducing technologies, alternatives, and practices. The voluntary program was developed in 1994 by the EPA, USDA, and FDA as a means toward pesticide risk reduction through improvement in the use of existing conventional pesticides, as well as research into alternatives, technologies, and practices that reduce the pesticide risk to both humans and the environment. The Rotterdam Convention on the Prior Informed Consent Procedure for Certain Hazardous Chemicals and Pesticides in International Trade, PIC, was signed in 1998. It is a legal binding program. Exporting countries are also required to notify the importing country of the restricted or banned status of the product they are trading, and the product cannot be received until the importing country acknowledges that information. Labeling criteria are included in the PIC. The U.S. is not a party, though U.S. requirements are more stringent than those of the convention. The European Union passed the world's most stringent law aimed at protecting citizens from toxic chemicals. The law protects American consumers because it applies to chemicals used in products sold in the European Union, and because so many American companies' products are also exported to the European Union. The companies need to comply with the new standards so their products can continue to be both sold in the United States and exported. The new legislation, called REACH, or Registration, Evaluation, and Authorization of Chemicals, will force industries to register and submit health and safety data for approximately 30,000 toxic chemical substances and replace the most hazardous ones with safer alternatives. Approximately 1,500 of the most hazardous chemicals may be banned or restricted, including some compounds used in electronics, furniture, toys, cosmetics, and other everyday items. Toxic torts are a group of methods of recovery when individuals are injured or killed by exposure to toxic substances. Torts include negligence and strict liability, and a successful case seeking compensation may apply both theories. Negligence requires a plaintiff to prove that the defendant had a duty of care to the plaintiff and that the duty was not met, and that the failure resulted in injury to the plaintiff that could be compensated by the courts. Manufacturers generally have a duty to not expose others to an unreasonable risk of harm, and they may fail to adequately warn about known or expected dangers of using their product. Strict product liability is applied when the plaintiff must prove that the defendant engaged in an abnormally dangerous activity that caused the plaintiff's harm. Manufacturers are strictly liable when products are defectively and unreasonably dangerous. Unreasonably dangerous means that it is not expected by a reasonable consumer and that the manufacturer failed to utilize a less dangerous, reasonably feasible alternative. In both negligence and strict product liability, there are problems with proving causation. This is very much true in the toxic tort cases. Tracing back harm to a specific chemical is difficult because the harms, like cancer or birth defects, oftentimes may have multiple causes or connections, are based on studies that do not provide solid conclusions. The courts have used individual cases to define what establishes a link between actions or chemicals and specific harms. Enterprise or market share liability happens when a manufacturer that produced a defective product that was sold interchangeably with other brands of the same product can be held responsible for the percentage of injuries proportional to the percentage of the market share. This is useful when there is a time lapse between exposure to a toxin and the resulting injury, or when multiple manufacturers are involved. This is done to benefit injured plaintiffs because manufacturers as defendants are deemed as more able to bear the cost of remedy whatever injuries occurred. Are deemed as more able to bear the cost of remedying whatever injuries occurred. The goal in a toxic tort case is to be compensated by recovering damages. Damages can compensate physical and intangible losses, but punitive damages may also be added on to punish wrongful conduct and deter others from acting similarly. Despite various arguments, corporations as an entity can be held responsible for punitive damages even if the tort occurred some time ago. If there were multiple harmed plaintiffs or there was a cost burden to the company.